Okay, let's get started. My name is Thorin Tritter. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center in Glen Cove, New York, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our weekly Curator's Corner, an online program that we launched as a way to share information about particular items in our collection while our building is closed. And I hope all of you are staying healthy and safe. Before I start with my presentation, let me encourage you to pose any questions you have by clicking on the Q&A button, which should be either at the bottom of your screen or at the top. Typing in your questions, I'll either respond to them while I'm giving my presentation or at the end of the program. Okay, so today I want to focus on this photo. It's in our second gallery. This is a different type of object than most of the things I've spoken about in previous editions of the Curator's Corner. It's not tied to a particular individual or a particular family. It's not a one-of-a-kind item. This is a reproduced photo. The original is held by Yad Vashem, and we're very grateful for their assistance in letting us show it in our gallery. This is, I think, a slightly better image. You can see what the photo looks like. Let me ask you, what do you see? And take a second to look around on the image. I think obviously you can see the Nazi SS officers who are leading a group of men through city streets. You can see a crowd has gathered to watch them as they're marched through the streets. Looks like maybe there's some bicycles or something on the left behind the marching men, suggesting that perhaps people have come from different parts of the city or from the surrounding area to watch this procession. We know from Yad Vashem that this photograph was taken on November 10th, 1938, in the German town of Baden-Baden, a famous spa town located about 120 miles south of Frankfurt in southern Germany. The name Baden-Baden comes from the German word for bath. Baden, now used as a noun meaning bathing, comes from Old German when it was the plural of the word bath. Baden-Baden is the site of hot springs that were used dating back 1,000 years by the Romans. And the repetitive two-part name was meant to distinguish this city from other cities known for their baths or badens, like near Vienna or in Zurich, and drew on the fact that the German city of Baden was located in a territory that was also called Baden. So Baden-Baden really refers to the city of Baden in the territory of Baden. After 1933, when the Nazis came to power in Germany, the fact that Baden-Baden relied on international tourists for its economy meant that leaders of this city tried to avoid anything that could jeopardize the tourist trade. Here's a postcard showing the city in the period before 1938. According to accounts from Jews in Baden-Baden, before 1938, there was little outward sign of the anti-Semitism seen in other cities after the election of the Nazis. Of course, all the Nazi laws about fingerprinting of Jews, about adding the names Sarah and Israel to all Jewish individuals, registering them, all of those laws were imposed on the Jews in Baden-Baden, but there was little outward signs of the limitations on the Jews that you could find in other cities. But by 1937, after 4 years of tightening restrictions and 4 years of propaganda depicting Jews as evil and dangerous, some of the protections in Baden-Baden started to weaken. And on November 10th, 1938, the atmosphere in Baden-Baden changed altogether. November 10th, 1938, when our photograph was taken, was of course during the outbreak of violence that is known as Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht, often translated as the Night of Broken Glass, refers to a wave of violence against Jews in Germany and Austria that took place on the night of November 9th and during the following day on November 10th, 1938. The violence left shards of broken glass scattered on sidewalks throughout cities across Germany and Austria, where Jewish-owned businesses, homes, and synagogues were broken into, plundered, and burned, thus the name Kristallnacht. I don't like the name. I use it with quotation marks around it, and I'm reluctant to use the term when I can avoid it, because it's the name that the Nazis gave to this pogrom, and suggests by its name that the events on November 9th and 10th, 1938 mostly involved breaking shop windows, when the reality was far more brutal and deadly. This map gives you a sense of the scale of violence and destruction throughout Germany and Austria on November 9th and 10th of 1938. This was not, as the Nazi Party claimed at the time, a spontaneous outburst of public anti-Semitism, but instead, as we now know from documents, a coordinated pogrom, organized and directed by the police and the Nazi stormtroopers, the SA. Let me go back to our photograph, though. There is much to talk about in the photograph, but there is one particular feature that makes it distinctive. The men being marched through the town of Baden-Baden are carrying this sign. I think you can see it, this sign it's actually a yellow Jewish star that they are carrying at the front. I know that this image is not crisp enough for you to see what the sign says, but it says, "God does not forsake us" in German. Here's the caption that we have in our museum. A closer look shows that the sign is being held up by string that's held by the man on the left of the image, and that has been wrapped around a button on the coat of the man on the right, so that his hands don't have to actually hold anything to support the weight of this sign. Let me come back to the sign in a minute. As it turns out, there are a number of photographs that capture the events in Baden-Baden on November 10th, 1938. And we have the testimony of one of the Jewish residents, a Dr. Arthur Flehinger, who described what happened on that day. Dr. Flehinger taught in the local gymnasium and was one of the leaders of the Jewish community. He later recalled in testimony that a police officer appeared at his house at about 7 a.m. in the morning of November 10th, 1938, and ordered him to go to the police station. When he arrived at the police station, he found he was part of a group of about 60 to 80 Jewish men who'd been rounded up by the police and the SS. At about 10 o'clock, after waiting at the police station for several hours, these men were assembled in rows in the police courtyard, and the SS organized themselves around them. At around 11, they were marched out onto the streets, through the town, eventually ending at the synagogue in Baden-Baden. Our photograph is one of the many that were taken that day and that captured different moments in the humiliation and violence perpetrated against Jews in Baden-Baden. I want to show you some of the other photographs and then go back to ours to give you a more complete depiction of the events of that day. You will, I think, note that there are some similar faces in many of the photographs. The Jewish community in Baden-Baden was relatively small. Only about 300 Jews lived in the city in 1938. Here is a photo of the Jews lining up in preparation for the forced march through the city, subdued by the police presence outside the frame of the camera. There are then a series of shots of the Jews as they were paraded through town. This is one as the crowd is watching as the Jews are moved out from the courtyard of the police station. And just a few moments later, when you can see the long trail of the procession. We know it's the beginning of the march because we can identify the police station as the building on the right-hand side. Here's an earlier photograph that just shows the police station. And I think you can recognize the police station in the photograph of the crowd on March 10th. Here's a later photograph of the group being marched through parts of the city. People have ridden their bicycles to watch, come out of their businesses. And another view, slightly grainier, but following the Jews through the city. In all of these, you see the crowd watching. In some, you see people taking photographs. And of course, there's always the photographer who took the picture. The walk from the police station to the synagogue, according to Google Maps today, would only take 4 minutes if they took the direct route. But the Nazis arranged the march to weave through the town, making it a big public spectacle that took close to an hour. Here's the route that we believe the marchers were forced to take, and you can see the long, winding nature of the route, stretching out the humiliation. The procession of Jews finally arrived at the synagogue, which was a large building that had been built in the 1890s. I believe it was opened in 1899. Dr. Flehinger later recounted, the column neared the synagogue where the upper steps of the staircase outside were already filled with a mixed crowd with and without uniform. That was a real running the gauntlet. One had to pass by the mob, and they made sure to howl insults as the sorry procession passed. Dr. Hauser, a busy and much respected lawyer in Baden-Baden, got many punches from those who claimed the right to use their fists. This too was captured on camera. Both the first men who managed to go through with only verbal abuse and the latter part of the procession that faced a more physical crowd. According to Dr. Flehinger, in the synagogue, everything had been turned upside down. The holy floor of the architecturally so beautiful temple had been defiled by vile hands. The house of God had been turned into a playground for black uniformed hordes, the SS. What followed was a program of harassment and humiliation inside the synagogue. The Jews were forced to sing the Nazi anthem of Horst Wessel, and when some didn't know the words or were singing it quietly, they were forced to do it again several more times to show that they knew the words. They were also made to run around the sanctuary and do some calisthenics like it was a gym rather than a holy building. And several men, including Dr. Flehinger, were made to go to the pulpit and read sections of Mein Kampf. This too was captured on camera. After an hour in the synagogue, the group was marched down the hill to a hotel where they were given lunch before being loaded onto a bus and taken to a train station where they were sent to the concentration camp at Dachau. The men from Baden-Baden were some of the 30,000 Jews arrested during Kristallnacht, the pogrom known as Kristallnacht, and imprisoned on November 9th and 10th. So where does our photograph fit into the chronology of the day? As you may have noticed, the other photographs do not show the sign at the front of the column of men. Here, when they're departing the police station, there's no sign. Similarly, the lead procession in these other photographs, you don't see any sign. A close look shows that the men leading the procession in our photograph are also different from those in the other photographs. These men here are the leaders in both of these pictures. Here's another view where you can see it zoomed in, and I think you can see that we're talking about the same men leading that procession. Compare those leaders to the men in our photograph. You can see they're different. Indeed, it is a man in the third row of our photograph who appears to be one of the men who led the procession in the other photographs. One clue to where our photo was taken is the fact that it shows people walking down a hill. If you match the topography of Baden-Baden to the photograph, it suggests that our photographs were actually taken after they left the synagogue. Here's a picture of Baden-Baden with the synagogue. You can see it's on the hill, and the police station and the hotel is actually closer to the viewer in our case, the road being over on this side, and they're being walked down from it. If our picture was taken after the events in the synagogue, then it also makes sense that the order of the procession would have changed and there'd be different men leading the column than in the march to the synagogue. And the sign makes a bit more sense too. It was only after the Jews had been humiliated in the synagogue and had seen their place of worship defiled that they were given the sign saying that God had not forsaken them. This was just one additional jab as a way to publicly humiliate this Jewish community. There was one more act of Nazi violence in Baden-Baden on that day. As the Jews were being led away from the synagogue, the crowd, and likely the SS, lit the synagogue on fire, and that was also captured on film. There have been various efforts to memorialize the events in Baden-Baden on November 10th, 1938. On the 50th anniversary in 1988, Germany issued a stamp with the image of the Baden-Baden synagogue burning and the words, "The secret of redemption is called memory," inscribed on the stamp. In Baden-Baden, a marker was placed where the synagogue once stood, saying, "Here stood the Baden-Baden synagogue, destroyed by arson on November 10th, 1938. Another marker stands near the building where the police station was located, and it has the words, "To commemorate the victims of the persecution of the Third Reich," up on the top. And throughout the city of Baden-Baden, Stolperstein, or stumbling blocks, have been placed to mark the homes of where Jews who were arrested and murdered lived. The one at number 10 Prince Weimarstrasse says, "Here lived Dr. Arthur Flehinger, born 1884, forcibly retired on December 31st, 1935, fled in 1939 to England." He would later die in 1961 in England. The rich photographic evidence of the events of Baden-Baden in 1938, of which our photograph is one part, I find chilling. The SS proudly look and walk toward the camera that must have been in the middle of the street. The crowd, often including people with their own cameras, capture the humiliation and are there to somehow enjoy it. The men's hats are removed, which may not be a big deal today, but was in 1938 an additional way to embarrass the Jewish men. It's painful to look at these photographs and to think of the bullying and harassment. The plan in 1938 was to get the Jews to leave Germany, not to murder them, but to get them to leave without any of their assets. Those had to stay in Germany. The pogrom on November 9th and 10th, 1938 was meant to be a dramatic shove to get the Jews to leave that came after 5 years of laws that reduced Jews to a separate class of resident, no longer citizens. And indeed, there was a significant uptick in outward emigration from Germany after 1938. About 36,000 Jews left Germany and Austria in 1938, 77,000 the following year. Historians talk about the events of Kristallnacht as one of the most important turning points in National Socialist anti-Semitic policy. After the pogrom, anti-Jewish policy was concentrated more and more concretely in the hands of the SS, who had organized the events in Baden-Baden and across the country. In addition, the passivity or even outright support with which most German civilians responded to the violence of November 9th and 10th, 1938, and which is perfectly visible in our photograph, signaled to the Nazi regime that the German public was prepared for more radical measures. And as we know, the regime moved eventually from encouraging emigration to forced deportations to the east and mass murder. Our one photograph tries to capture that turning point. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you again for joining me. If you have questions, I see there are some, but please type them in the Q&A. I want to, as always, remind you of our future programs that are coming up next week. Next Tuesday at 11:30, I'm going to be offering a virtual tour of our museum. And next Wednesday at, oh, sorry, this says 1:30, it's at 1 o'clock. Our program next Wednesday at 1 o'clock, not at 11:30, will focus on a light bulb from a synagogue in Drama, Greece. So that's Wednesday at 1 o'clock next week. I hope you will join me for those presentations. You can find a full list of our upcoming programs on our website, www.hmtcli, under the Events tab. And I hope you will also make a donation to enable programs like this to continue while our building is closed. Okay, let me turn to the questions that I see here. Has hatred increased anywhere as a result of people wanting to have more tourists come there? Were people able to let each other know if attacks have occurred? The relationship, at least in the 1930s, between tourism and outward violence was a complicated one. But in general, Germany tried to reduce the outward understanding of what was going on. And so places where there were foreign tourists were places where you had less outward violence. Uh, Dinah Kramer mentions that only the men were paraded. That's true. Only the men were arrested and paraded through town. Only the men were arrested and sent to Dachau in 1938. The rest of the families were left alone. Were people yelling racial slurs at the group? Absolutely. Dr. Flechinger, in his testimony, talked about how they were yelled at, although he also says that he thought that the crowds, many in the crowds, actually did not support the humiliation. That's a hard one to judge, but he thought that the residents of Baden-Baden were kind of forced to be present, but didn't actually want to support it, at least some of them. Yes, so somebody points out the claim of I never participated is made problematic by seeing photographs like these, where there's so many people standing on the side, not stopping the event from happening. Did any of these men ever return home? There were men who survived in Baden-Baden or through the war. I'm not sure of the number of people who returned back to Baden-Baden at the end. I'm sorry, I don't know that. Have any of the SS officers in the pictures been identified? That's another one. I don't know the answer to that. These pictures were certainly well circulated, and so they may well been a part of some of the investigations. How did Dr. Flechinger, if removed to Dachau, get to England? Dr. Flechinger and many of the other people who were arrested on November 9th and 10th that were sent to Dachau were only kept in Dachau for a little while. And particularly if they could show that they were leaving the country, they were then released from Dachau. And Flechinger was able to get to England and so convinced the German authorities that he was going to be leaving, and they let him out. I'm just seeing, were there any signs of resistance, Jews or others, during the pogrom or at any outrage afterwards? Dr. Flechinger describes in his testimony that he felt there was no opportunity for him to say no at any point. He couldn't say no to the police who arrested him. He couldn't stop. It was apparent that there was too much force around him with the number of the SS guards, and so that there was no option, and they were always very limited in their actions. He did also say, though, when he was forced to read the section in Mein Kampf, he read it very quietly so that essentially nobody could hear. He was beaten for this, but others who followed him also read it very quietly and refused to speak loudly. So there was resistance from the Jewish community as this happened. Okay. Thanks very much for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you at our other programs again soon. Have a good afternoon.